And I think we still have some more folks that are going to be joining us, but for time's sake, we're going to go ahead and get going. So I will just start us out really quick. So hello, welcome, and happy World Oceans Day. We're so excited that you could join us today as we dive into a discussion all about abalone. This webinar has been made possible through support from NOAA Fisheries and is being recorded for later viewing from the Creeklands Conservation website and CLC YouTube channel. My name is Emily Sampson, and I'm the Conservation Outreach and Projects Coordinator at Creeklands Conservation, and will be your host for the next hour. If at any time you have questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A queue at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address as many of these questions as possible during our Q&A at the end. Before we begin, I'd like to take a quick poll. If you could please answer the following two questions that should be popping up on your screen. So our first question is, how familiar are you with abalone? So some of you may not be familiar at all, which is excellent. Our hope from this webinar is just to spread the word about these amazing sea creatures. But some of you might be very knowledgeable on abalone. We'll give you some time to answer that. Getting some answers coming in, wonderful. And then our second question is, what are you most interested in hearing or learning about abalone today? And you can select more than one. Give it a couple more minutes, make sure everyone has an opportunity to respond. Got about 85% of our attendees have voted. A couple more minutes. Okay, we will go ahead and end our poll. And I will share our results. So it looks like we have nobody in our group today that doesn't even know what an abalone is, so that's great. But it seems like a lot of you are familiar, but excited to learn more. So we're excited to have you. And it also looks like across the board, we're just interested in learning all about abalone, and that's what this is about. So I'm excited. Thank you all so much for being here. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick introduction. Let me exit out of our poll really quick. Wonderful. So I'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists who are here to share their experiences as it relates to abalone. We have Anne Velisis here with us today. Anne is an award-winning author of 3 environmental history books, including her latest work, Abalone, The Remarkable History and Uncertain Future of California's Iconic Shellfish, which I have right here. Highly recommend. If you haven't read it, please check it out. We also have Mona Olivas Tucker joining us. Mona is the tribal chair of the Northern Chumash Tribe, or the YTT. And next we have Dr. Ben Ruttenberg. Ben is the director of the Center for Coastal Marine Sciences at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And last but not least, we have Don Chartrand, the executive director of Creeklands, who will be our moderator for today's panel discussion. Anne will start us off with a presentation on abalone, and then we will dive into a panel discussion with our 3 guests led by Don. And then finally, we'll finish up with a Q&A with our audience. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Anne. So you can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily. I'm just going to begin without my screen first. I'm honored to be here speaking with all of you this morning. And I'd just like to start by telling you a little bit about how I started on the path of writing a book about abalone. I was exploring a cove in Big Sur and I found a shell, actually this beautiful little shell, and its iridescence was so stunning to me. I was literally inspired, and I just had to know more about the animal that made this beautiful shell. As an environmental historian, I research and write about people's relationship with the natural world through time. And because particularly interested in food history, I was somewhat already aware of abalone as an amazing wild food. And as it sounds like most of you know, it's an animal that's been a big part of California identity and culture, kind of like a lobster in Maine or salmon in the Pacific Northwest. For a time, as I'll explain, they were incredibly abundant, but then declined sharply, with two species now on the endangered species list, and most all others considered to be species of concern. When I started to learn about abalone, I found that people of a certain age who'd spent time on the coast had incredibly fond memories of foraging for and eating abalone, but answers to the question of what happened to them were less clear. And some younger people I found had never even heard of abalone and didn't even know what they were. So I realized there was a rich story to write about and an urgent need to better understand how it is that we let the wild animals we cherish, especially those that we use as foods, become imperiled. And the story of what happened to abalone is important because it's a big part of our West Coast heritage and it's also relevant to the challenges that we now face in conserving marine life into the future. So, in my short time this morning, I'd like to help set the stage for the discussion by taking you on a tour, a brief tour through some of what I learned when I was writing my book. So let's begin with the basics. Abalone are marine snails. There are 7 or 8 species on the coast, depending on if you're a lumper or splitter. These beautiful shell photos were taken by Buzz Owen, a shell collector who started as a commercial diver back in the 50s. Here he is with a big red abalone shell. Reds are the largest species in the world, and this shell is particularly giant. You could serve a salad in it. Abalones range along the whole West Coast, but were especially prevalent in California. There's a cluster of species that generally favor cooler northern waters and a cluster that favor warmer southern waters. Most abalone are subtidal. Here again is a red. This is the most common in your part of the coast. The holes in the shell are respiratory pores, which are used by the animal for breathing and also for expelling waste and for broadcasting gametes for reproduction. Abalone are long-lived, slow-growing, mostly sedentary animals that primarily eat kelp, which they sit and wait for torn-off bits and pieces to float by that they then reach out to grab with their tentacles. So starting at the very beginning, the longest phase of abalone history is before people showed up. The oldest abalone fossils found on the West Coast that you see here in that little vial are nearly 70 million years old, which I think is mind boggling. Through millions of years of evolution, abalone developed a big, powerful foot to grip tightly to rocks and a strong shell to clamp down around their bodies as shelter. Both foot and shell help to protect them in a sea of hungry predators. But both these attributes would later become compelling as a delicious meat and is a brilliant, beautiful shell material when humans showed up. Most archaeologists now think people first came to North America following along the coast, the kelp forest highway. An abalone dinner eaten 13,000 years ago is some of the earliest evidence for human habitation on the West Coast. Based on archaeology in the Channel Islands, we know that these and other shellfish were important for the subsistence of growing human populations for millennia. Then, about 6,000 years ago, beautiful shell artifacts started to become more common, revealing that abalone were used increasingly for cultural purposes, tools, adornment, ceremonies, and trade. Here are some beautiful creations made by indigenous people in Northern California around the Bay Area from about 1800. And this photo of a hoopa dancer in the early 20th century shows abalone in ceremonial dance regalia, representing a profound spiritual use of the shell that stretches back thousands of years up and down the coast and that continues to this day. One highlight of my book research was going to see traditional ceremonial dances of North Coast tribes, where I learned that abalone is valued not only for its glimmer, but also for its spirit and song, the powerful sound that the shells make when they clack together as the regalia is danced to life. The relationship between people and abalone entered a new phase with the arrival of the Spanish on the West Coast, first with galleons, then with missionaries and more mercantilists in the 1700s, a period of history that we're still reckoning with, when indigenous people were subjected to the brutal disruption of their subsistence, culture, and lives, while newcomers with different views took over their ancestral lands. The Spanish soon put abalone to their own use when mariners realized they could pick up the brilliant shells and then sail north to trade with native peoples far up the coast for sea otter pelts. By the turn of the 19th century, the fur trade moved south to California, decimating sea otters and unwittingly starting to unravel undersea food webs. With their top predator killed off, abalone that had previously been constrained to live in protected crevices spread out into more exposed areas, reproduced without check, and became super abundant throughout the nearshore marine environment. Monterey in particular became famous for its shells, which British and American mariners called Monterey shells and California shells. But the name that finally stuck, abalone, was derived from the indigenous word of the local Ohlone people, Alun, which you can see here as a place name on a historic Monterey map. I like to think that that indigenous heritage of abalone it's interesting that it still persists to this day. But for our story, the most important thing to note about this pivotal time is that the new superabundance of abalone was fundamentally misinterpreted. Newcomers streaming into California regarded plentiful abalone as the natural state of the coast. They did not realize that they were seeing an ecosystem that had already been severely disrupted. With the earlier ecological history and traditional knowledge lost, it set us up to misunderstand the biology of this animal. The next phase of human abalone history begins with the gold rush. Chinese immigrants sailed across the Pacific hoping to find gold, but some found a different treasure in the flourishing abundance of abalone. An abalone rush soon began near Monterey, with hundreds of Chinese gathering shellfish from rocky shores and shallow waters. The Chinese had a long heritage of holding abalone in high esteem for beautiful inlay work and its rich umami flavor, and so a large export market for shells and dried meat quickly developed. Over the next 60 years, Chinese fishermen took abalone from shallow waters, followed by Japanese fishermen who, using the new technology of hard hat dive suits, took abalone from deeper waters. As millions of abalone were removed for this export fishery, drying racks and large piles of shells soon became common sights up and down the coast. It's important to note that through this period, there were tremendous racial hostilities. And so, in the absence of any other fishery conservation or management policies, local, state, and federal laws that targeted the immigrant fishermen for xenophobic reasons intermittently restrained this fishery. But by the turn of the 20th century, the massive buildup of intertidal and shallow dwelling abalone was in many places diminished from the former abundance that people had known and believed to be natural. Newspaper headlines started to warn that California's abalone were headed for extermination. This was a time when Americans were first becoming concerned about conservation, having witnessed with the bison and passenger pigeons that we could eradicate species through market hunting. East Coast salmon and shad runs had already been decimated too. In that context, California aspired to do better by using scientific management. So the state's brand new Fish and Game Commission set size limits for the first time in 1901 and then directed biologist Charles Lincoln Edwards to study abalone in Southern California. He became one of the first biologists to go underwater, learning from Japanese divers. And he soon affirmed that the risk of extermination was real. He didn't think size limits were enough and recommended visionary conservation strategies, including setting the side of abalone reservations. His ideas were never acted on by the commission, but the xenophobic legislature took a different tack to wholly prohibit and shut down abalone exports in 1913. The racially motivated policy gave slow-growing abalone a reprieve. Meanwhile, a new kind of interest in abalone had grown. With the arrival of the railroad, tourists started to come to California to appreciate fresh air and beautiful scenery, and abalone soon became a star attraction, with tourists collecting them by the hundreds. At a resort on Catalina Island, one popular activity was to take a glass bottom boat tour to view our undersea marine gardens. Tourists could pay their boatman a quarter to dive down and retrieve an abalone shell, which soon became a quintessential California souvenir. Increasingly, too, residents and visitors who identified as sportsmen hunted abalone for recreation. As the shellfish became more scarce in the rocky nearshore areas, sportsmen blamed commercial divers for taking too many, while commercial divers thought sportsmen were to blame. This time, an invertebrate biologist drawn into the fray determined that red abalone put out millions of eggs every time they spawned. Presuming that the shellfish spawned every year, he theorized it would be impossible to delete them as long as size limits were followed because the animals would be able to spawn many times before being fished out. These findings affirmed the belief that abalone were inherently super productive and led the California's Commercial Fisheries Agency to dismiss earlier concerns about conservation. The idea that size limits could maintain a sustainable fishery became something of an abalone management mantra, and in the context of enduring superabundance, it seemed to work for a while. But unfortunately, no one understood yet how the biology of this animal was fundamentally connected to its ecological history and the larger environment. Meanwhile, abalone became more popular through the promotional efforts of one of California's first celebrity chefs. Pop Ernest, pictured here, developed a new recipe for fresh abalone fillets, and when the state banned all dried abalone exports, he was well positioned to promote it as a premium seafood for California eaters. Eventually, Pop built a restaurant right on the Monterey Wharf, buying his abalone direct from Japanese fishermen, thereby helping to keep the fishery going strong. So as domestic demand for abalone grew, commercial take continued to grow as well. And as beds near Monterey worn thin, the industry moved south. Near Morro Bay, the Pierce brothers learned the trade of hard hat diving by watching Japanese divers and started to harvest fresh beds along the central coast. With new gas powered boats and air compressors, divers could routinely take 100 dozen abalone a day, building up a whole new industry. By the start of World War II, in just a decade, a small number of divers had fished out 10 million pounds, or about a quarter million animals. Meanwhile, in Southern California, the new sport of skin diving was started in the 1930s. Here are the Bottom Scratchers, the world's first diving club. Skin diving and then scuba diving became increasingly popular through the 40s and after World War II. So through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, abalone were taken, eaten, and enjoyed in communities up and down the coast, becoming a fundamental part of California's 20th century beach and recreation culture. So here you can see an overview that shows annual landings from commercial fishing steadily climbed, with a big break in the middle for World War II when Japanese fishermen were interned. But when the fishery resumed after the war, with many returning veterans joining its ranks, the catch ramped up to a high peak of more than 5 million pounds taken in 1958. But soon thereafter, commercial landings began to drop and then plummet without advanced warning. So, what happened? It was not one, but a number of things, of course, hitting like big waves, one after another, piling on to finally erode that historic mass of built up broodstock, and ultimately to reduce populations of some species to alarmingly low levels. First, in central California, sea otters rebounded. It had been thought that these animals were wholly extirpated from California by the fur trade, but a small population was rediscovered near Big Sur in 1938. By the late 50s, otters had ranged southward and entered an area near San Simeon, considered to be the most productive abalone beds in the state. Just look at all that kelp. It soon became clear that they loved to eat abalone. This set off a bitter and intractable conflict between commercial abalone fishermen who wanted the state to move sea otters elsewhere and those rooting for sea otter recovery. As the fishermen saw it, the sea otters did not follow the size limits and they were eating down what they considered to be natural broodstock, their broodstock, since it supported their livelihoods. The otter supporters saw sea otters resuming their rightful place in the marine ecosystem. And this is a key pivot point in the story because up until this time, people had believed that abalone were an inexhaustible seafood and that their prevalence was natural and owed to the animal's inherent superproductivity. But the return of the sea otter revealed a whole new understanding. In short, there would have been no abalone fishery at all had sea otters not been decimated earlier. The abalone fishery had been based on a historic mass of built up stock, a windfall that was being gradually mined out by fishermen and now otters too. At the time, knowledge of kelp forest food webs with sea otters as keystone species influencing the entire ecosystem was still just emerging based on new ecological research in Alaska, where scientists studied islands with and without otters and found far richer kelp forests where otters were present. I think most people are familiar with this, but for those who aren't, the drawings on the right show the basics. On the top, the otter keeps the kelp grazing urchins in check, allowing for rich kelp forest to thrive. And on the bottom, when urchins become dominant and graze down kelp, it simplifies the whole ecosystem. It was impossible to apply this science from Alaska to California's more complex ecosystems, especially in the midst of such a contentious conflict. But it was the start of a paradigm shift where we began to see the wild animals we use as foods not only as a crop to be harvested every year, but also as parts of more complex ecological communities. There was a lot more going on underwater than we knew. But I want to underscore that this was a situation where the way that everyone, from fishermen, fishery managers, and community members, had been perceiving marine ecosystems through their lived experience and lived memory was literally challenged, dissolved, and had to be reconstituted. It was hard. It was a case where people could see things one way and then another, not unlike iridescence. Most important, inheriting the wrong story or just part of the story had not only caused us to misperceive the biology and ecology of abalone, it set us up to be poorly positioned when additional stressors started to hit. Ultimately, sea otters became a protected species, and red abalone didn't go away. They persisted in their traditional crevice habitat, but there was no longer a surplus for commercial fishing within the otter's range. At that point, the abalone fishery moved south again. Increasingly, commercial fishermen used bigger, more powerful boats to reach offshore islands, and there was still rising recreational take too. But despite the newly emerging understanding of abalone's history, there was no significant adjustment to how the fishery was managed. By the early 70s, California biologists determined that overfishing had already significantly reduced abalone broodstock in many areas, and that the animals couldn't keep up. They tried to ratchet back fishing pressure, but the politics proved impossible, in part because people presumed the otters would continue to expand their range. Another consequential thing happened in Southern California, El Ninos, a big one in 1958, and then an even larger one in 1983. El Ninos affected abalone in several ways. Warm water and storms devastate kelp that abalone eat, reducing the animals' growth and also their ability to reproduce. Until this time, it had generally been presumed that abalone reproduced every year. But scientists who studied what happened before and after the 1983 El Nino discovered this was not the case. But that really wasn't realized until years later, so fishing continued on stocks that were not regularly reproducing. In addition, an epidemic disease called Withering Syndrome, amplified by the El Nino's warm water, also hit in the 1980s, knocking out 99% of black abalone, our one intertidal species, and likely affecting others as well. And if that weren't enough, biologists realized that no one had seen a white abalone in a long time. When they failed to find them with regular dive surveys, State and Park Service biologists searched deeper waters with a small submarine. But after several days surveying 77,000 square meters of reef, they found only four. Here's a view from the sub looking at one of the lone white abalone. Reviewing the data and historic surveys, the biologists hypothesized that the once abundant animals had been unwittingly fished out, leaving too few too far apart to reproduce. It's called the Ali effect when animal populations are reduced to extremely low levels. They have trouble reproducing because mates can't find each other. In the case of abalone, the animal's gametes, broadcast out into seawater, can't find each other. As biologists pieced together the dire straits of the black and white abalone in Southern California in the early 1990s, these and other species were still being fished commercially. At that point, they realized California could no longer manage abalone for a fishery. It had to manage them for survival. The commercial and sport fisheries were closed south of San Francisco in 1997. Ultimately, white abalone would become the first marine invertebrate to be listed as an endangered species in 2001, with black abalone to follow in 2009. In retrospect, I think it's important to realize that it was not easy for fishery managers to foresee when these animals would reach a critical tipping point, from being wholly available to the fishery to becoming imperiled with so many different stressors piling on. This underscores the importance of taking a precautionary approach to managing all the animals we still use as wild foods, and ideally of having an agreed upon fishery management plan in place ahead of time so everyone can be on the same page when the chips are down. But it also points to the importance of thinking about whole ecosystems rather than just single species because there are so many interconnections between creatures that need to be considered. So I want to shift gears now to tell you what's been happening to some of these animals more recently. With the endangered white abalone, with so few and so far apart, biologists knew there was no way they could ever reproduce. So back in the late 90s, they decided to bring in some from the wild to start a captive breeding program. In my book, I recount this effort with all its monumental challenges. The bottom line is that it's much harder to recover an endangered species than it would have been to conserve it in the first place. But after some heartbreaking setbacks, in just the past couple of years, scientists have finally figured out how to breed large numbers of healthy juveniles. Here you can see one of these animals up close. They're pretty cute. And in the fall of 2009, captive raised white abalone were outplanted for the first time. Putting these baby abalone out into an ocean full of predators is a big part of the challenge for recovery. And so different methods are now being tested to see what will best protect them as they become reestablished. And hopefully, all that's being learned in recovering endangered white abalone can be applied, if need be, to other species and other marine animals in the future. With the endangered black abalone, the intertidal species most heavily afflicted by withering syndrome, the approach has been different. It's always been hoped that there might be some pockets of disease-resistant animals, and it turns out that in very few places in the Channel Islands, black abalone have persisted and may be starting to show some signs of rebound. They've also persisted in the cooler waters of the Central Coast, but recently made news when debris flows buried hundreds of them, necessitating a rescue and translocation. Finally, I want to tell you about the red abalone. In Northern California, where communities had always resisted commercial abalone fishing and also scuba diving, so a tightly managed freediving only sport fishery continued to thrive based on the historic buildup of abalone broodstock. Tens of thousands of divers and shore pickers were coming every year from all over the state and beyond to hunt for abalone in kelp-rich coves, and then to head back to campgrounds to pound and fry up abalone in a tradition that in some families span generations. But then a perfect storm of environmental stressors hit. In 2011, there was a harmful algal bloom that killed off hundreds of abalone. In 2013, a sea star wasting disease swept up the coast, decimating the stars, including these sunflower stars now considered to be mostly extirpated. It turns out that sea stars are important predators of purple urchins, and so without them, aggressive kelp-eating urchins grew without check. Then in 2014, a marine heat wave hit called the blob from the north and El Nino from the south, making it harder for kelps, which need cold, nutrient-rich water to grow. Between ravenous urchins and persistent warm water, Northern California's kelp forests were reduced by more than 90% in just a few years, leading to starvation of thousands of red abalone and the closure of the long popular sport fishery in 2017. The massive extent and speed of this undersea transformation has been unprecedented, heartbreaking, and sobering. And unfortunately, the dynamic is also occurring on the outermost Channel Islands, which share similar oceanographic conditions and ecological communities with Northern California. And so I see abalone through their plight in all of this as sentinel animals, calling us to recognize the increasing vulnerability of marine life in the face of our climate crisis. Many people are now looking at different ways to address this suite of problems coastwide, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this from Don and Ben about some local efforts. But in Northern California, people are now trying to create urchin-free oases with sport and commercial divers removing purple urchins in strategic coves to maintain pockets of bull kelp and red abalone. Some scientists are working to bring back sunflower sea stars, that voracious urchin predator, through a captive breeding program. In Oregon, a consortium of tribes and NGOs is considering, as a longer-term project, the feasibility of restoring sea otters, another urchin predator missing from the system. And in Southern California, there's long been efforts to restore patches of degraded mainland kelp forests, so there are lessons to draw from there too. But perhaps most important is that while these actions can help to conserve biodiversity in limited ways, ocean conditions remain an overarching driver for canopy kelps. Meanwhile, we've also come to realize that these great undersea forests are incredibly important for sequestering carbon and thereby helping to stabilize larger climate conditions too. So kelp is key, everything is connected, and there is a lot at stake. So as citizens of the West Coast and at planet Earth, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment. Through the history I've shared, I hope you've gained an appreciation for some of the profound and enduring cultural values of abalone, for how earlier generations derived tremendous economic benefit and enjoyment from abalone. But now these animals need for us to give something back. Hopefully, the perspective of history, what we've gotten wrong and right in the past, and all that we've learned can inspire and help us in this project moving forward. We need more people to learn and care about marine environments. There are no easy answers, but we will need to come together to find new ways to rebuild resilience in our ocean ecosystems if we want marine life to persist with us into the future. As I worked on my book, a telling detail I discovered early on really stuck with me, that many different cultures from all around the Pacific have associated abalone shell with vision. And so it's my hope that sharing the story of abalone can help us all to see a better path forward for these cherished creatures and for all of the life of the sea and earth. Thank you very much. So hopefully that overview can set the stage for our discussions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anne. I'm sure the rest of our audience feels the same, but I feel very inspired, and I'm very excited to open it up to our panel discussion. So Dawn, if you'd like to take it away, we've got about 15 minutes to have some good Q&A with our panelists.
Perfect. Yeah. And I tell you what, I've read your book twice. I've handed out, I don't know how many copies now to friends and colleagues, because I think it's a very important resource actually for anyone who cares about California's coastal marine ecosystems. But to hear you actually tell the tale live was really a pleasure. And I thank you again for your passion and for your journalistic leadership, really, and helping us kind of put all the pieces together. And yeah, it was, Emily's right. It was a real inspiration. That book came at just the right moment. I'm sure that Ben and I will get to say a little bit about kind of what's happening here on the Central Coast with respect to some of the conservation measures you mentioned. But before we get there, I thought it would be really fun to hear, firsthand from Mona, who is the tribal chair of the Yaktichu Tichu Yaktilhini. How did I do, Mona? YTT. All right. Okay. The Northern Shumash. Mona and I have become a little bit acquainted, and I'm looking forward to deepening the acquaintance as we really kind of remember and bring in the cultural perspective as recovery commences in the near shore. Mona, I have a question for you. Would you mind saying just a little bit about, from your own perspective, the cultural history with abalone between the Northern Shumash? And then also, I would love it if you could just reference that tale you told me about your brother and your dad.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be with everyone this morning. And your presentation was amazing. I'm glad that it's recorded, and with your permission, I'd like to share it with several other people. It just brings everything together in a way that really informs us. It breaks our heart, but it really informs us. So thank you for that. So I thought that I would start out this morning in honor of World Ocean Day is to share with you our word for ocean. The Northern Shumash indigenous language is called the Tilhini language. And so to say the ocean, the word the in used in reference to the ocean is yacht. It would be spelled Y-A-T. So yacht is easy to say. And then the word ocean is spasini. And spasini is probably easy enough for you to say. Sometimes we have sounds in our language and there is no English phonetic equivalent. But if you say yacht spasini, you're saying the ocean. And you would only say that in a good way. You would never use it in some kind of angry or unpleasant context. And Dawn had asked me some questions, and we had a telephone conversation a couple of weeks ago. And I have a long history of engagement with the ocean. You know, we're ocean people. We live on the western edge of the North American continent, and the abalone have been here, much longer than we have, because, as we learned today, we're talking about millions of years. And so that association, though, between my people and the ocean, it's interconnected. It's not them and us. Same thing with the sky or with the earth. All of that is connected. So her discussion about the connectivity of the kelp forest, look at that on a global scale, because everything is connected one way or the other. And we also believe firmly, if that ocean's not healthy, we're not healthy. If that sky's not healthy, we're not healthy. If the earth isn't healthy, none of us are. And so her lessons in that presentation, I understand them and agree with them. So having lived here all of my life, roughly 35 years in Oceano and remaining 35 years in Arroyo Grande, I've never been far from the ocean. And as a young girl, fish was a big part of our appetite, and abalone was a big part of our appetite, of what we ate. And yes, I do have an appetite for fish and abalone. But one of the things we knew was that, you don't always take the biggest and the best. You have to leave sometimes the biggest and the best alone so that they can reproduce, and you'll have others that become big so that you can feed 4 or 5 people instead of 1 or 2 people. And that was done for a couple of reasons. First of all, it just made sense. It was just common sense. I don't know about the breeding age of abalone, but I know those large abalone were, and sometimes the biggest fish, you just needed to leave them alone. But also it was out of respect for that person, that abalone person, that fish person, leave that person alone. They have other things that they need to do, and they don't need to be killed off by us. In your presentation, I was just so disheartened to see those mountains and mountains of abalone shell. That was senseless then, and it's senseless now. I have a hard time accepting that it was okay even at that time. But that story has repeated itself time and time again. by taking down old timber and, fishing all the fish out of lakes and things like that. I do know that abalone, and maybe that gentleman had, I don't know how large that abalone shell was that he had, but there is evidence of abalone being 18 inches. And I'm 5'4", and from the tip of my finger to my elbow is about 18 inches. So if you can just envision from the tip of your finger to your elbow, that's I've never seen an abalone that size. Lots of archaeological sites here on the coast have evidence of abalone. Almost all of them do, actually. And I've seen pieces of abalone, rarely an intact shell. And you can kind of extrapolate, this was a large abalone, but nothing approaching 18 inches. And you did talk, Anne, about the abalone ornaments and ornamentation then and now. And the things that you talked about then that happened a long time ago, the same thing is happening today. I'm going to try and show you this necklace, see if I'm able to do it on Zoom so that you can all see it. So are you able to see this necklace? So this is made by contemporary artist Leah Matapagua, who is a cousin of mine. So the use of abalone shell in ornamentation continues today. And the very same thing you mentioned about just the sound of it, it's its own sound, and it's quite beautiful. And then you might have something as simple as this, just a small piece of abalone, and you might just make a necklace out of it. But abalone as a food source, high protein, delicious food source that was somewhat more common, maybe not exactly common, but we had access to it as a young girl. We all know that it's not available any longer at all. But even access to shells, once the abalone population is gone or nearly gone, then of course the use of their shells, the same thing happens. And so the tribe has little or no access to shells to make these things that I just showed you. And I looked this morning and saw online a 5-inch abalone shell, 5.5-inch abalone shell, which has to be either a farm abalone or somebody really took a very tiny abalone. And it was $40. And that's for a little, very small abalone shell. And I'm pretty sure that was a farm abalone, which means the shell is much thinner. So I don't have too much more to say right now, except that the loss of abalone is devastating to tribal people, but I think to everyone, because the loss of the abalone means so much more than just its loss. It's the loss of an entire ecosystem.
Well, thank you, Mona. That was articulate and very, very timely, and sets the stage. I hope, Ben, I hope you're all queued up to deliver a hopeful message about some of the stuff that we're trying here on the West Coast and hope to achieve in the next coming days. Are you up for it?
Yeah, and of course, Anne and Mona, thank you both for your kind words. It's going to be hard to follow both of you to cover anything that you have not already covered in great detail.
Ben, I wonder if you would just say what comes to your mind about the various species. Anne did a nice job of describing the outplanting of the white abalone and the difference between conservation efforts for white versus black abalone. But why don't you just go into a few sentences of what you understand is the state of the art of. Let's just focus on white abalone for now.
Sure. So again, and a phenomenal setting of the stage, and I really don't have a whole lot to add other than as you mentioned, there is a captive breeding program that's now headquartered up at the Bodega Marine Lab up at UC Davis. They have, again, had some heroic efforts to get those white abalone to spawn. The good news about the white abalone is that their captive breeding program has begun to exceed the capacity of the facility up at Bodega. And so they are now sort of spreading abalone out to, in some cases, commercial facilities and other marine labs to add space to continue to grow these white abalone. So in some senses, this captive breeding program has been quite successful. They now have have, I don't actually know what the numbers are, but it's going well enough that they need more space. And then the outplanting, I guess, was what, the end of sometime in early 2020 was the first.
Yeah, they've had actually 3 outplanting expeditions now,
Yeah.
so they're actually ahead of schedule a little bit with introducing new juvenile animals into the rocky reef environment in Southern California at undisclosed locations. But so far the reports are good. They are having some settling of the juveniles, and there's hope for self-sustaining wild populations down the road. Ben, both Mona and Anne, I think, touched poignantly on the topic of ecosystem restoration and sea flower sunstars, for example, and the role that they play in a complex but self-sustaining kind of balance in the near shore. Can you talk a little bit more about how that's going?
Yeah, so I think, Anne, the way you described it was beautiful, calling the abalone a sentinel species, that they really do kind of indicate the status and the sort of intactness of these systems. And we've learned over the last 30 to 50 years, in some cases, these ecosystems that we thought were untouchable, fisheries that we thought were inexhaustible, and those quotes that we couldn't possibly overfish these abalone, those same phrases have been used for fisheries time and time again in all parts of the world, and in all parts, every time someone has said that, they have turned out to be incorrect. And a lot of that just highlights just how fragile these systems are and just how powerful our ability to disrupt these ecological frameworks are. Without getting into all of the causes, the nice thing, I guess the good thing on the scientific side, is that we're starting to get a pretty good understanding of, in some cases, how these ecosystems function. And in most cases, if we can reduce some of the threats and some of the pressures, these ecosystems, without us having to necessarily reassemble them, they will recover themselves. And so in large case, in many parts, that means creating things like sanctuaries and marine protected areas, where we reduce fishing, we reduce some of these other threats. But and like you mentioned, up on the North Coast, this is this perfect storm between the sea star wasting disease that took out the primary sunflower stars, the sun stars up there, and then the warm water and the El Ninos that greatly reduced the algae, the kelp, have allowed these urchins to thrive, which essentially reducing the food supply for these abalone. And so the reports that I've heard from the North Coast are basically that the abalone are starving, because there simply isn't enough kelp to sustain their populations. And so in some cases, what maybe some of the solutions up on the North Coast, as you mentioned, trying to do some actual reductions of the urchins, manually going in and pulling some of these urchins out. There are some people who are trying techniques to ranch them. Basically, that means pulling the urchins out of the water, putting them in tanks with some other food, raising them up. That actually provides some uni, that's the sea urchin gonad, which is very valuable in sushi restaurants. And so you're creating an economic incentive to then go and remove the urchins. That's not just for conservation. There's also an economic incentive, in some cases making that a little bit more effective, right? There's more people involved. And so in many cases, we've also learned in ecosystems, there are these tipping points. And so once we pass a tipping point, ecosystems can start to spiral down. But the positive aspect of that is that if we can understand where those tipping points are, if we can move us back to that system, these ecosystems will begin to recover themselves. And so in some cases, things like trying to by humans, we're essentially mimicking the recovery of sea stars by humans harvesting that's effectively increasing predation on them. We may be able to reduce those sea urchin populations enough that the bull kelp will be able to recover. And so some combination of bull kelp restoration, sea urchin removal, and the sea star breeding program to introduce a few of them back into the system may be enough in some places to begin to recover these systems. And again, once you begin to recover them in some places, it's going to be easier to recover them in other places.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to jump in and say we only have about 9 minutes left. I could talk about this topic all day, but we only have our panelists for a few more minutes. And we have some very interesting questions in the Q&A. So Emily, if it's okay with you, I would like to just go ahead and throw out some of these questions that have come in, unless there's another way you want to handle it.
Absolutely, fire away.
Right on. Well, my friend Andrew asks about Paua. He's a Kiwi, and that's what they call their version of the abalone down under. And he asks about the health of the species down there. Anne or Ben, do you want to speak to Paua?
I can take a stab at it. Here it is. I have somebody came from New Zealand and brought me back a shell that's very polished up. It's a beautiful purpley shell. Um, and I know in Australia and New Zealand we've had some of the same issues with with the abalone, with the Paua, because of heat waves and such. They've managed it differently there, and so. It may not be quite as in dire straits as we have here um, everywhere, but they're having the same problems with urchin barrens and heat waves as well. So abalone all around the world are cherished and beloved, and when they became part of a global commodity market, um, all around the world, people were driven to fish them, and so there's impacts everywhere, unfortunately.
Well, so I think what I'll do, Ben, unless you've got something you want to add. All right. I'll just jump in there and add my 2 cents. I think this is as good a place as any to introduce the notion of the black market and poaching threat to abalone and Paua and all the other local common names that they go by. The genus Haliotis has, a number of species. I think it's between 30 and 130. I think that there's still debate about the variation of species, but there's 7 clear species here in California. And poaching is a real issue for not just abalone. Of course, there's lots of different creatures that are taken illegally every year. But in particular, abalone, hope that people can find a way, and dive clubs can be involved, and local communities can take it on themselves to learn how to achieve better harmony with the biosphere, is how the UN likes to say it. And I think that sounds a little bit like the language that Mona was using earlier to describe how the YTT found themselves in nature, in a relationship with nature, where it's not so much a extraction focused kind of relationship. We need to have a little bit more of a ethos of not just sustainability, but regeneration as we actually enjoy the products of nature. So that's my 2 cents on the question about Paua. It is not considered endangered at the moment. However, there are really very serious black market and poaching threats there, as well as climate issues. And so the climate issue is the next thing to bring up. We have an attendee who asks, are abalone able to move north naturally with climate change, as some plant species and other kinds of migratory plants and animals are actually adapting to climate change and are able to kind of spread their number north, actually, to escape some of the growing heat in the central bands. I think the answer to that one, as far as I know, is unknown. But unless Anne or Ben, do you have anything to add about species distribution subject to climate change?
I would say that, abalone, they don't have a good way to move north. There are some anecdotal stories about abalone hitching a ride on kelp and getting blown north or getting blown to new places. They've studied how far can abalone gametes travel in the ocean. Part of the story I didn't go into is, there used to be the time when people thought, oh, they'll just go wherever. But it turns out that they only are viable for a short period of time, and they have to go and land someplace where they can make a home. So those are things that make it hard for abalone. If you imagine the coast, there are places where abalone habitat is that rocky shore reef separated out by beaches, and so it isn't easy for them to make it north. That said, they have spread out over a long period of time, but it's going to be hard for them to do that in a short period because they're relatively sedentary.
Yeah, I mean abalone, as Ann mentioned, abalone spawn what we say pelagically. They reduce their gametes into the water column. Fertilization happens there, and then they have this larval phase where they are out in the water. And for abalone, that larval phase tends to be very short. Some organisms like lobster can be out for 6 months to a year, so they have plenty of time to move around. The larval phase of abalone is in some cases just days. And so they tend to disperse. That is, that they move around on those ocean currents relatively short distances. And there's some evidence from some places like Baja where they've studied this dispersal process where they're moving, hundreds of meters to maybe just a few kilometers, and probably not much more than that in any real numbers. And so, while yes, it's possible, as Ann mentioned, that historical spread happened over thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. And so the time scales we're talking about are mismatched, that their habitat is becoming more difficult for them to live in over the scales of years to decades, whereas their spread generally requires a whole lot longer than that. And so there's certainly the possibility that they might be able to move, but it's much less likely for abalone than it is for other species that have either a more mobile adult phase or a longer larval phase.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so the other aspect of the question from our panel or attendee was about other species of abalone, and are there any that are robust in number at the present time? And again, I think I'll take the first stab and then let smarter people than me weigh in. I think the answer is that some of the numbers are okay. For green abalone seem to be reproducing well. Pink abalone are under pressure further south along the Baja coast. Pinto abalone are having trouble in the northern parts of their range. And red abalone need help as well. But green abalone seems to be the one that's sufficiently robust that doesn't need intervention at the present moment, but you never know. What do you think, Ann, Ben, Mona, if you have anything to say about that?
I would just say that I don't think I mean, I agree that green abalone people feel comfortable with right now, but I don't think any of them are really robust. And I think the recent history has shown us that we have to be aware that they're more vulnerable than we think. But that means it's harder to find, animals that can be used for translocation and restoration. I mean, that will probably be the type of thing that we will need to be looking at if we want to do restoration and regenerative restoration in the future. But if there aren't enough animals to use to do that, it's a problem. So it was long thought that the red abalone that were doing very well on the North Coast and some of the deepest waters of the Channel Islands were kind of, very robust and sufficient. But at this point, they no longer are. And so, I mean, it's an important thing to keep an eye on. In this story, I am always trying to find the hope of how we move forward. But we also, I think, have to be eyes wide open and realize this is a serious thing, so that people realize we gotta figure it out and get on board. So anyway.
Very good. Emily, go ahead. I think you're getting ready to say something.
Absolutely. Well, we're just coming up on our hour mark. And so if we have any last minute questions, please feel free to send them in. And if we have not been able to answer your questions, feel free to shoot us an email. We'd be happy to answer them after the webinar. But I think our final closing question will close with, we have an anonymous attendee asking how long are abalone expected to be on the endangered species list? So for white and black abalone, I wonder if things continue to go in the direction that they have been successfully with the outplanting for white abalone. Is there an idea of how long they might last on the endangered species list, or do we not know?
I'll just take a stab at that and just say, I don't think we know, but it will be a decadal scale before we can get populations that are self-reproducing to the point where they can be ready to go on their own. So that's kind of what I would think.
Ben, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You know, the white abalone, we're just starting to outplant them now, so it's going to be many years until we have a handle on if the white abalone outplanting has been successful. And correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that there has only been one event of black abalone spawning in captivity, I believe. And so trying to get the, you know, there is no captive breeding program for black abalone at the moment because we cannot reproduce them in the lab. And so the scope for reproduction and you know, repopulation of the black abalone is going to be very long until we can figure out how to spawn them in captivity. There certainly are pockets where they're present still on the central coast, and you know, I've seen them in some places down in central Baja, very remote areas, but their populations are certainly a whole lot lower, and it's going to be a really long time until they recover. So I agree. I don't see them coming off of the ESA anytime, you know, in the next at least several decades.
Well, thank you all so much. We are truly appreciative of your time and sharing your knowledge and expertise on abalone. Don, do you have any closing thoughts for us?
I guess the last thing I'll say is, first of all, a massive thank you to the panelists and for your presentation again. Thank you to all the attendees who listened in. Really appreciate that. And I think the note I want to end on is you know, I'm excited about our next webinar down the road that we will have to talk with this group and perhaps an even larger group about potentially exciting developments here in the Central Coast to accelerate the conservation efforts of abalone. So stay tuned. Thank you again.
Thank you all so much. And just a quick shout out to some of our Cal Poly interns who have assisted us for some abalone lesson plans this last quarter. Shafali, Kyle, and Chantal, I know you're on the call. Thank you so much. We're hoping to continue this outreach and education ongoing. So we hope that you'll join us next time. Thank you so much.